Well, thank you so much, and welcome to day 2 of the Delphi Forum. And now it is my pleasure to begin this conversation with Pierre Gramegna. He is the Managing Director of the ESM. So thank you so much, sir, for being with us. I have to ask you, as perhaps just to set the scene, the point of this conference usually is to pick up zeitgeist and see where the mood is. One of the things that I've picked up is there's a real concern now about the energy crisis, that this is going to hit Europe much harder than certainly politicians would make you believe at this stage, and that this crisis is totally underpriced. Would you agree with that?
Kalimera first. I understand that the language here is English, but let's pay tribute to the host as one of the words that I pronounce best. Let me also say that it's a privilege and pleasure to be here for the second time in my life, because the first time I came 50 years ago, I was a student with my Latin teacher, and at that time, as a teenager in the middle of the 70s, when I visited the Oracle, I probably had in mind what's going to be my future, what has life in store for me. But at the time, we had already the first oil shock, exactly when I visited. So you ask me now the question, what about the consequences of this oil shock or energy shock due to the geopolitical turmoil that we have on the planet, and in particular in the Middle East? I think that everyone is now realizing that this conflict and this instability in that region and the consequences on the energy market might last for longer than first anticipated. The markets are still acting in a way that they think the crisis will end soon, and that was also the takeaway of the meetings in Washington last week at the IMF. But the latest developments show what Gabriel Garcia Marquez has nicely put in 100 Years of Solitude, and that is, it is easier to start a war than to end a war. So that's what the market hasn't priced in yet completely. Still, I would say that over the last days, I think the market is not reacting with a knee-jerk reaction up and down by 10% in one day, but is a little bit more in a waiting mood. If you speak with leaders, political leaders, economists, they all tell you, and it's confirmed also by the International Energy Agency, that the destruction that have taken place during the war in the last 2 months have already created a lot of damage. So the supply of oil and of gas will not be normalized quickly anyway. And I think also the people see it in the gas stations all over the world. It's a conflict that you could call in a way regional, important obviously regional, but the consequences are worldwide.
And I have to ask you, because the wonderful thing about this forum is that it brings together the policy element, politicians, but also business. And you hear a very strong business community here. And what they say is that the message and almost the urgency coming out of the European institutions still does not match the gravity and the severity that they see. They're talking about companies that say, fuel crisis, this is going to be a real issue. Companies, certainly the airlines, already having to cut some services. Is this intentional because the message is not one of panic, or is there really a problem in the way that the policy side is assessing this crisis and the reality of a day-to-day business? Because their message is far more severe than what I hear coming from the institutions.
Well, I would say that the European Union, in its forecast, has been probably more realistic than others, which I won't mention, other institutions, and certainly more realistic than markets. The ones that are least realistic, if I may use that word, or are maybe being a little bit complacent in the market, I think institutions are already factoring in. Now, it is obvious, inflation is already off target. Had we not had this crisis, this crisis, this turmoil, these geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East, Europe would be on track for a growth of 1.5% and with 2% inflation. So a very good spot to be. But that's not where we are anymore. Inflation is already getting close to 3%. The expectations are that this might, and that's what the European Central Bank says, might for next year still be slightly above 2 if the conflicts end immediately. But nobody can foresee that. And what is also clear, the European Central Bank has said it, so talking about institutions, that if it persists and inflation anchorage is not ensured in a couple of months, obviously they will have to act. And I think it is important to realize that what matters here is really the inflation rate, because that translates immediately. Some people say, well, there might be less growth. Yes, this will also happen. But what really triggers the change is high inflation or higher inflation. And let's also face it, this is a difference with the crisis we had in 2022. In 2022, the inflation went up also rather quickly, but from nearly zero. And interest rates were also close to zero. Now they are at a more normal rate of 2 to 3%. So the impact is faster. And the buffers of countries, I'm not speaking only of European countries here, but most countries, also because of COVID, that left a mark on many budgets, I think the room of maneuver of most countries are less. Now, there's some exceptions. I would like to say that this country we're in, Greece, has a better situation now than it had 4 years ago, because Greece has done a lot of efforts, like in fact all the countries that the European Stability Mechanism assisted back in the last decade. They have done structural reforms and are today harvesting the benefits of doing those reforms. But this is not the general case, neither in the European Union nor around the world. And if you look at the growth rate of Greece in the last couple of years, growth rate of Greece has nearly been double the average of euro area countries. Obviously, that generates more revenue and ensures fiscal buffers.
And now that we establish the scene with a situation that is not going to be resolved overnight, and even if you assume there's a sort of peace deal that can stand the test of time, at least for a few years, the shocks obviously leave scars and second-round effects. But I wonder, however, and this is the inevitable follow-up question, how prepared is Europe this time around? And I ask you this question because when this crisis started, the European Union insisted we took a lot of lessons from Ukraine. Gas is different because you need the infrastructure through the pipelines. Obviously, at the time, nobody fully expected the Strait of Hormuz to be fully shut off. But we've heard this message that there are lessons, there are buffers. How prepared is the European Union really at this stage, knowing, however, the debt and deficit is much higher than before? Fiscally, it's quite tight.
There's a lot of things that I'd like to answer to this very important question. First of all, if you look at the average of debt to GDP of the European Union or the euro area, those who have the euro, is around 90%, 90. This is far lower than the debt of China or the debt of the United States. So I never hear anyone asking the question, how is China or how is the United States going to deal with these same issues, because they are geopolitical issues that touch everyone. So we have a framework in Europe.
But
so
people would say in the US, the Fed can print, certainly if they now get a much closer Fed chair to Trump, and in China, you'll do what Xi Jinping tells you to do.
Yes.
The EU is a bit more complex.
You can say that. I'm not contesting what you're saying. I'm just saying you cannot overdo it either. I mean, when you see at what speed the American annual deficit increases and at what speed the total debt of the United States goes up, I don't think that markets will always consider that something to neglect. What I want to underline is the European Union is the only area in the world that has a fiscal discipline which is overarching the countries. doesn't make it easy, but at least we have this reference. And the new Stability and Growth Pact also better caters to the needs of countries by favoring a little bit more investment compared to the old Stability and Growth Pact. But that's just first thing. Let's compare with other areas in the world. So in other words, I can say we shouldn't be more strict when analyzing the situation in Europe than with the rest of the world. This being said, yes, we have less buffers because we had the COVID crisis and all the decisions that were taken after that, and whatever it takes, meaning that we're going to support consumption in the country, and it took some time to unwind all these measures. And in fact, that's the first lesson we need to learn, and I think it's a mixed bag, but it looks relatively good. The measures that countries are now taking to alleviate the burden of more expensive energy is that the measures should be targeted to the ones that are vulnerable and not cross-board for everyone, that the measures are temporary. I'll give you an example. If you decide, because of the energy crisis, that VAT rates or excise rates should be reduced, which is a major decision, make sure, first of all, it's a general measure, so it shouldn't be taken. But if it is taken, then make sure you have a sunset clause in and say it lasts for 1 month or 2 months. And as soon as the situation alleviates, automatically with the sunset clause you can stop it, because otherwise this measure might stay in place 1 or 2 more years. So it's very, very expensive. And then the measures must be, what I would call, apart from temporary and targeted, they must be tailored. What do I mean? What is the signal when energy prices go up, gas or oil? Well, people should start to do savings in consumption of energy. Second, we shouldn't try to go back to carbon and fossil fuel more to compensate for that, because we should keep in mind that we have done major restructuring in terms of reducing our dependence on fossil fuel. And we need to continue to develop clean energy, especially renewable energy. So we must not be in contradiction with this medium and long-term goal, which is changing our life on an everyday basis. So you see, which measures you can take to alleviate the pain should be well thought through. So that's a lesson to learn. And if I look at Greece, you have increased the amount of renewable energy a lot in the last years, from 1/5 of energy that was generated in Greece that was renewable, you're now at 1/3. And I think this is key for us. What's at stake for us, Europe, which is a region of the world that is more impacted by the crisis because we are an energy importing continent. Staying on course for renewable energy is an absolute necessity, not only because of this crisis, because it's an issue of strategic autonomy and energy autonomy. So we have this goal, we must stick to it and keep that in mind when we take measures.
So you think, you know, I didn't have this question in mind, but now that you bring it up, you think staying on the path of a Green Deal, those green targets, that is still the way to go for the European Union? And I say this because increasingly, certainly in this energy crisis, a number of member states have signaled, at the very least, they should be paused.
Well, I don't think that's the general policy. I beg to disagree. It's the general policy of the European Union, confirmed by the Commission and Commissioner 𝘀𝗀, that we must go for more renewable energy. In fact, this crisis proves the point that we are more vulnerable than any other area in the world if we depend too much on fossil fuel energy, mainly oil and gas. So I think it's in a way the other way around. What Europe has maybe overdone is over-regulation. Also in the area of climate change and use of energy. So be smart about it, but definitely not change the course.
And not to get too controversial, but since you mentioned these measures, some would argue what this crisis proves is that Europe does not and has not managed to secure energy supplies and energy security. There is no energy security in Europe, and until that is fixed, we're treading on very thin water. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you're maybe overstating it. I mean, the reserves that we have accumulated are much higher than they ever were. The International Energy Agency is working very closely with all the countries, and specifically in Europe, to release some of the reserves. We have reduced to a large extent our dependency on Russia for energy since 2022. A lot has happened there. We have diversified our sources of energy. And again, reinforcing the point I just made, we need to have more and more renewable energy, which depends on ourselves, instead of being dependent on the rest of the world, because unfortunately we don't have a lot of energy in our soils.
Thanks. And another question, and I guess this is now really the key question. You have decades of experience both in your home country but also at a European level. The idea was that the EU would focus in the first semester on the economy and competitiveness. There was a big summit with Mario Draghi in attendance at the start of the year. And if my memory serves me right, the idea was by the June European Council, there should be a sort of comprehensive plan on how to really reboot the economy. All of that, to some extent, has now been put aside because the focus is dealing with the short-term crisis. So how are you going to manage the short-term issues with the long-term perspective of the EU? Because it seems that is also the problem. It's crisis to crisis does not allow for a long-term vision.
So you rightly said that, Maria, that we have the goal of delivering a lot for June at the summit and also in the ECOFIN. And I think that's still on course. This is on course, and I want to dispel the idea, because that's often mentioned, that on the Draghi report and on the Letta report being on strengthening and modernizing the single market, and the Draghi report concentrating on increasing Europe's competitiveness, that nothing happens. Mm-hmm. I can tell you I've rarely seen, and I see that really vividly every month in the Eurogroup where I sit as the managing director of the European Stability Mechanism. I've rarely seen as many directives, important directives on the table for competitiveness as we have now. And I've been finance minister for 8 years in the last decade. There wasn't the recognition that we were lagging behind so much on competitiveness. So I think member countries are very mobilized, and the Commission has put some of the most important translations of the Draghi report and of the Letta report on the table, and they are being discussed. Now, some might say, like always, Europe, it takes too much time. Yes, it takes more time by definition than if you act nationally. But that's something that we have to recognize. But I think the degree of urgency that we need to have these decisions taken now and implemented very quickly is there.
So you don't fear that this new crisis related to the energy market is going to now lead to another wasted year of progress?
No. No, this is happening in parallel. Why would we also delay that discussion? I mean, we have hours and hours to discuss all the topics, and obviously the emergency answers that we have just discussed because of the energy shock is taking center stage in the media, but the rest is advancing. I can reassure you. And
before we move on to the ESM in particular, the answer sometimes in Europe, and this is certainly a debate, is just putting more money on the table. Of course, the Eurobond debate has never really quite left the room. It's always still present, more so than ever in some areas like defense. Is that ultimately the way that the EU will go? It's about more joint borrowing, perhaps tailored, but it's solutions that will come through fresh money and joint money.
Well, it's very important that you ask that question, and that's one that's always in the back of the mind of many countries. And I'm glad that Deputy Prime Minister is now in the room here, my good friend 𝗀𝗄𝗄 Hatzidakis. I would say, looking at it first and foremost through the angle of financing might not be the smartest way to approach the topic. I think when you look at, we have 3 institutions that issue what you could call Eurobonds. It is the European Investment Bank, the European Stability Mechanism, which I represent here today, and the Commission with the NGEU program that was decided in the aftermath of the COVID shock. So these three institutions do that because there are specific issues where there was consensus that we need to finance that together. For the EIB, it's obvious, it was decided a long time ago, for projects, for cohesion, for helping develop targeted policies. For the ESM was because of crisis management. And when you look at it, Next Generation EU was also crisis management of COVID. So what issues do we see in front of us where we think that common action would be so much smarter and more efficient than single action? Well, I see definitely two. One is defense, and the other is climate change. Let me start with climate change. When I came here 50 years ago as a teenager, the word climate change, I don't even know if that word existed. Now, today, it's on everybody's mind, and we know that we have commitments to do it, not only because we want to abide with international engagements, but because it is our best interest, as I mentioned before, if we want to be independent from outside countries for energy, and because we want to save the climate and the planet. But let's talk about defense. On defense, we know, and we have committed, all of us in the European Union, to spend 5% for defense in the years to come in NATO, for those countries that are in NATO. So that's a lot of money. If every single country does this on its own without coordination, we're going to have duplication. We're going to be very inefficient. So it's obvious that in an area like defense, common financing would make a lot of sense. So you ask me, is there space for more Eurobonds? Eurobonds as a catch name, I would say we must look into defense as an area where we have to act together. And I'm convinced, that's a personal opinion, it's also the opinion of the European Stability Mechanism, in areas where acting together is so much more efficient than acting alone, it deserves to be done and financed together.
And I want to ask you two final questions, but specifically, we've seen how the leadership now, they want to see strong Eurogroup, European Investment Bank that is aligned with the general vision, and obviously when it comes to the ESM too. So how do you see your role in this context in which the leadership, and I'm referring to the EU leaders, are now saying we all need to move in the same direction. We want to see stronger action from all of these different bodies. So what role do you see for yourself?
So I will speak last about the ESM because we are the lender of last resort. So as long as we can find other solutions, that's what we should focus on. Now look at European Investment Bank, for example. They have become much more active in financing dual-use weapons, to just give one example.
But is there a need for more coordination in between the different bodies? Yes. I guess that was.
Yeah, and well, this is not easy because defense used to be seen, apart from the NATO alliance and the general commandment in NATO, it used to be seen very nationally. The last time we had a discussion about European defense was back in 1954. So that's 3 generations ago. So we must wake up to the needs that we have today. And you are right. It is the prime ministers, the presidents of our countries that need to focus on it to give this direction to make sure that we can have more common action in the area of defense. Now, where does the ESM come in? The ESM has a lending capacity of 500 billion euro on the markets, out of which 430 are available. So maybe one has to think of the ESM coming in not only like it was the case for Greece, Spain, Portugal, to mention a few, in times of financial crisis for those countries, but we have also instruments to prevent that a crisis unrolls and becomes larger. So we have credit lines that we could use to alleviate the burden on national governments. So we are obviously exploring that. We know we have the tools, but obviously it depends, coming back to the decision of the countries to do it. And again, if there is other ways before getting to the ESM, which is the lender of last resort, to do that, all the better.
And then just finally, as a final question, as we're running out of time, but I have to ask you this. Since we talk about the political momentum and the coordination and working together, it's not a secret that Viktor Orbán will no longer be in office. He will not be in government. So I got to ask you, is it going to get easier from now on?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. And I draw two lessons from this. Why do I say yes? Yesterday, the 90 billion package of financing Ukraine was agreed because Viktor Orbán was not there anymore to block it, although he had committed to accept it and then changed his mind. But let's forget the person and let's look at the broader picture. The second thing I want to say on the Hungarian election is that democracy, plural democracy in Europe exists and works. There were many people that were doubting that it would be possible to oust Viktor Orbán. And what has a free election allowed? Well, we have a change. And it's the people of Hungary who have changed the course. So we are luckily on a continent where we have free democracies. We should cherish that. We should highlight it. We should underline it. Now, I anticipate your next question, if I may. But look what happened in Bulgaria. It's going to be the same as Hungary. Well, I would not prejudge that. And I would say that what we have seen in Hungary is good news. And I'm confident that also Bulgaria will be constructive for Europe, because there's no other way. Does anybody in this room think that in these geopolitical times of turmoil and fragmentation and conflicts, we need less Europe? I don't have to think twice. We need more Europe, because only together are we strong enough.
Well, we'll see how the two new prime ministers do. Mr. Gramegna, thank you so much for joining us and for this conversation at the Delphi Forum.
Thanks a lot, Maria. Thanks.